Dr. Eugene Tssui is an architect, urban planner, artist, teacher, visionary, and the author of this book, Evolutionary Architecture, which is the way I know Eugene. And he's our guest in Conversations today. Eugene, welcome to ESF.
Thanks very much for inviting me here.
Glad to have you here. So, evolutionary architecture, what is it?
It is looking at nature, really studying nature scientifically, trying to understand the principles involved in nature, the concepts, the strength to weight ratios, the reasons why shapes and forms are the way they are, how they're used, all the processes of why they come about, taking that knowledge and applying it to the built environment. And so it's really trying to understand the way nature thinks and works, and then interpreting that in a way that human beings can live in a better environment.
Let's have some examples of some of your designs, which are actually quite radical and quite innovative. So, up on the monitor, we have some images of some of your designs. Tell us a little bit about this.
Okay, well, this is the Tssui Center in Napa Valley, California. That's a portion of it, only one small portion. What you see is the cafeteria and office area. And really, there's 5 of these spheres. They're about 35 feet in diameter. And the reason for the use of spheres is that the sphere is a very strong structure, probably the strongest in the universe. It minimizes the amount of materials and maximizes the volume inside. It also is very aerodynamic, so cooling, which is the Napa Valley is in a hot part of California, so cooling was very important. And also fire was something to be concerned about. So the spheres have a sprinkler system on the outside. So you just turn on a spigot and the whole sphere is drenched in water, which makes it virtually impossible for fire to burn anything. So the shape is thought of as multiply functional, and it's minimizing the materials, maximizing the volume and structural strength. So that's why the use of spheres in that particular location.
Some of your designs, such as the design for a house you built for your parents, look an awful lot like living things. The one that you built for your parents looks a lot like, to my mind, a giant clamshell. And so here's an example of it here on the on the screen. You have these rather interesting embellishments, the entryway. What inspired this design?
Well, the overall inspiration was the fact that my parents wanted to live in an absolutely safe house. And there was earthquake considerations, there were flooding considerations, things like that. So I went to nature and I said, okay, what in nature is the most indestructible thing? And I came across a tiny little creature called the tardigrade, which is the only creature that we know of that can survive outer space. That gives you some idea of just how tough it is. It survived outer space for 10 days. And so, and was brought back in, and they had some water and walked away. So I started to research the tardigrade. How and why was it able to resist such incredible forces and environments? And started to make inquiries and developed a design that mimicked the tardigrade in structural ways, in its use of passive solar abilities. There's no air conditioning in the house. There's no heating system. It's all response to the natural environment around it. And the way the house is shaped, the oval shape, is something that also I got hints from the tardigrade, because if you look at a tardigrade from an aerial view, it is oval in shape. And the oval shape allows for stress and strain to be thrown away from the shape of the building. So if in case of an earthquake, in case of high winds or flooding, the the stresses against the house will be directed away from the house. Also, it's aerodynamic. It has these veins in the roof that allow it to cool and heat itself in different times of the year, and then a south-facing window which allows the interior at low sun angles to warm the house on the inside. So the house is like a living creature that adapts to the natural environment around itself. And that seemed to me to be the way architecture ought to be. And so I looked to the tardigrade to give me ideas and instructions how to create a better, safe environment.
You know, as a biologist, I look at some of your designs, and the striking thing about them is how faithfully they incorporate biological form. You have some designs that look like well, you have one set of renderings of a building that looks like an electric eel, a torpedo, for example, as your Noah's Ark design, and you have others that look a lot like little creatures with snouts and things like that. And as a biologist, the interesting thing to me about that is that you're very strongly incorporating biological form into structures, and the implicit or perhaps explicit assumption there is that if you mimic biological form, you'll somehow mimic biological function. And for example, how does building something in the shape of a tardigrade confer, you know, all these wonderful attributes on the ability of the house to function properly?
It doesn't. That just copying the shape doesn't do that. But of course, the shape gives you some structural advantages, like I mentioned before, how it, you know, how stress and strain is sort of tangentially thrown away from the building. But that's only a structural advantage. The processes of how and why things are created, like the termite's nest, the weaver bird nest, a wasp nest, these kinds of things. You have to understand why those things, how they work and why they work, and how they relate to the inhabitants of the nest, and how they relate to the external natural surroundings. You know, the wind, the rain, the sun, all of those things. I'm not just copying shapes for the fun of it. I'm not saying, oh, this is, you know, a biologic design, so it looks like a fish, or it looks like a tardigrade, or an eel, or something. That is not what I'm doing. I'm trying to understand the thought behind the creation of these living things, and then trying ways to apply those concepts, those thoughts. So, you know, if a dragonfly's wing is not just a wing, it's not just a flapping object. There's also very subtle design aspects. That it has a kind of a shutter, a shingle system that flaps. That allows air to move around it quicker. So I'm trying to understand how these processes work and why they work, and how they help the tiny organisms inside, how they protect themselves and how they can contribute to their lives. So I'm really trying to understand the whole process of the structure, the reason for it, not just the appearance. And that's a big difference. I would say that by and large, architects today copy the form, the exterior form. I'm not one of those architects. What I want to do is understand how and why that form was developed, and then apply those to human everyday life. So that's a big difference between what I do and what other architects might be doing. Let's say the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing, China. You know, that was called a bird's nest because it looks sort of like a bird's nest. But it doesn't function at all like a bird's nest. In fact, if it did, it would be a much better building. So in fact, it's a clumsy, heavy, wasteful building that does not perform like a real bird's nest does in any way, shape, or form. There's no dimension to it that does that.
Yeah.
So, but if we had studied how birds' nests actually go together, it would be a fantastic result if we knew that.
Yeah. Okay.
So I just want to make sure that it's understood that what I'm doing is not copying nature. What I'm doing is trying to understand the thoughts behind nature, of the hows and whys that thing is the way it is, and then applying that, translating it to a language that we can use as human beings.
Okay. All right, the thought behind the design, an interesting concept. We're coming back with Eugene Tssui, architect, designer, urban planner, after the break. Welcome back to Conversations. Our guest today is Eugene Tssui, architect and author of Evolutionary Architecture. So Eugene, we were talking about the tendency of architects, especially biomimetic architects, as they like to call themselves, to imitate form in nature. And you were discussing that's really an inadequate way of approaching architecture. And
Absolutely.
So it would be fair to label you as a critic of the trend today in biomimetic architecture.
Yes, I would encourage that.
Okay.
Yes, right. I think that it should be publicly known that those architects are just copying the shape and form, the exterior appearance. They're approaching architecture as a decorative form, and that's the opposite of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to understand the why that form was built the way it is, and how those materials go together, how they're used, and why, and how it relates to the natural environment around it. But beyond that, I'm also trying to understand how these concepts in nature can be utilized for everyday purpose. For instance, the clothing I'm wearing today, they're cooled naturally by air. I have these ventilation systems in my pants and shirt, and you can see some of it here. And there's certain parts of our body that heat up, that need to be cooled in a hot day, like in upstate New York today. So how do we apply these thoughts of nature to our everyday lives? That's a crucial point, and that's what other architects are not doing. And so what I'm trying to do is, to say, okay, nature is thinking this way. How can we apply this to help ourselves? How can we benefit from this? And how can we use nature as a partner to create design? We are the students, nature is the teacher, and we should have that kind of approach to the understanding of nature, that we're trying to learn from it.
Just out of curiosity, is your clothing your own design?
Yes, my clothing is my own design. I work with a Chinese tailor in China, and together we develop, I draw out the designs, and together we figure out how to make them. And so this is one of the earlier models of the self-ventilating clothing. Yeah, and that's something that nature has taught me, is that insects and animals have a way to ventilate themselves. Their fur, the African wood bug has a perforated skin so that it keeps itself cool in hot savanna weather by allowing air to pass through its body. And so I'm taking the same kind of approach by saying, oh, how can natural air help us to stay cool too? And so it's not enough just to say, oh, well, then let's just make a ventilated shirt. We also have to study, well, how and why the human body works so that the best parts, the best places where we heat up the most are cooled. And so, that's just an extension of the approach that I'm taking about questioning nature, questioning the functions and the purposes of nature and everything it does. Again,
coming back to this issue of evolutionary architecture, the things that you're mentioning about philosophy of architecture, if you will, it parallels a very interesting debate that's going on in evolutionary biology right now. You know, and for many years, the standard model for evolutionary biology has been natural selection of genes, specifiers of function. And contrary to that, actually a more classical view is that it's not genes that specify function, it's genes that are driven along or drawn along by function. And it strikes me that when we're talking about applying evolutionary principles to architecture, a similar kind of issue arises there. You know, is an architect like a gene, a specifier of function for whoever happens to be living in the buildings, or is an architect a facilitator of buildings as a participatory process with the inhabitants that live in there? In other words, who's driving it? Is it the architecture, or is it the inhabitants of the building? And what's the proper role of an evolutionary architect in designing buildings? Are you a specifier, or are you a facilitator?
I'm both. And as any living thing in nature is, you are always considering the environment around you, all of the forces that play. In most cases, the sun, the rain, the wind, the weather, the humidity, so on. But as an architect, I'm also considering the social aspects of the social, the environmental, the economic, the health aspects, the moral aspects of people. So how can all of those concerns be a part of the design? You know, how do you make a better person with architecture? Okay. How do you make them healthier? Yeah. How do you make them think about their place in the world, their purpose in being alive? Okay. Those are also questions that need to be answered, and you might say I'm a facilitator of that. I actually ask my clients or owners, you know, what do you feel is your purpose in life? What's your dream? Yeah. And how can the building aspire to that dream? Okay,
hold that thought, and we're going to explore that more in the next segment. More conversations in a minute with Eugene Tssui. Welcome back to Conversations. We're here with Eugene Tssui, author of Evolutionary Architecture. So in the last segment, we were talking about architects as facilitators or specifiers, and you mentioned that one of the things that you think evolutionary architecture needs to do is to start exploring areas that most biologists are very uncomfortable with, that is social purpose, morality, those kinds of things, in ways that architecture can actually influence that. Let's carry on that line of thought.
Sure, I'd love to. That's probably the most important part of architecture, is how do you influence people to be better? How do you influence people to reach for their dreams? How do you influence people to be healthier, to consider the relationships with other people and with nature itself? How do you influence them in ways that make them more creative, that make them more confident about being creative? Those are aspects, I think, that are fundamental to good architecture. So that when you are in and around the building, you should feel like you're capable of doing things. You should feel like you have a purpose in life. And how do you do that? How do you enhance that? For me, the artistry of architecture is very instrumental to that. I've been told by owners of my buildings that when they're in the building, they feel there's a poetic aspect to it. There's a kind of repose and vitality to the environment that makes them want to be more creative. I can vouch for that from my own mother, who you know, I designed that building for my parents. And my mother started to create these shutters on the windows using different collage techniques of rice paper and things. And she composed different designs on the windows, partially for privacy and partially because she wanted to create an artistic environment. And I found that over the years, she became a more creative person. You know, she was trained as a Chinese opera singer and dancer and an athlete. And the house seems to have kind of awakened that over the years. And I was really delighted to see that.
Yeah.
And other people in other buildings have told me the same thing, that they feel energized when they're here, and they feel like they can do things that they ordinarily don't think about.
What is it about these designs specifically that you think works this magic with people?
Imagination. You know, if you live in an imaginative space, you become more imaginative. You realize, you see things you didn't see before, and every day you see an angle or a new perspective on things in the environment, and that of course must influence your sense of your place in the world. And so these people are invigorated by the environment they live in, and that, I think, is one of the most wonderful things about the space. I, in fact, didn't tell the owner of a building I did in Oregon that I was coming to visit, and so I knocked on the door, out of the blue, and the owner had moved away, and another person was living there as a student of law. And I said, so how do you like living in this building? He said, I thought it was kind of crazy at first, but now we've been here for 6 months, and we realized that it's actually influencing me and the family. We feel happier being here. And I said, well, okay, well, and what else? And he said, well, I came here as a law student, but after 6 months living in this house, and I have to say it's because of this house, I've decided to study art. And that's a pretty big switch, and my family is happier for it, because I'm a happier person. I'm really passionate about art. My wife and my 2 children are happy too, because I'm happier. And so I said, wow, that's incredible story. And he said, yeah, and it's some crazy Asian architect built this house, and I never did tell him it was me. And so I walked away, really feeling flushed with excitement and very contented and comforted by his little story. So that just showed to me that the buildings do affect people. And what better can you do? I mean, as an architect, that's the ultimate goal. And so I'm finding that this approach to nature, where do we go when we want to feel good? If we're troubled with something, we don't usually sit at home. We go out into nature by the lakes, the streams, the forests, the mountains, the desert, and we reflect on things, and we see the beauty, the detail, and the forces around us, and it makes us comforted. And so my goal was to take all of that in nature and express it in a building.
Some of the more interesting larger scale designs, you're talking right now about habitations for individuals, and it's very consistent with individual pursuit of happiness and liberation of creativity and those sorts of things. But some of your designs, getting into your career as an urban planner, actually try to scale those principles up to cities and communities, and not only is that interesting from a planning standpoint, but it introduces a very interesting dimension to this, namely, one of the principal social conflicts that we run into is the inherent conflict between individuals and social systems. And do you think that kind of liberation that you see in individuals can actually scale up to communities?
I do. In fact, I have a project now in Florida that's to design a floating city. We're just working out the concept now, but there's a man, believe it or not, there's a man in the United States who wants to build another nation because he's fed up with the way we've structured ours and around the world, that there are lots of troubles. There's stratification of society, there's economic problems, and so he'd like to create a floating nation. And so we've talked about how to do that, and I've created some designs for that, and I'm absolutely confident that if we create a city, something on the scale of a city, and that city has educational and invigorating, inspirational aspects to it, functional aspects to it, that will influence people about how they relate to one another, how they structure their environment, and their politics and everything. So I think that we're educative human beings. That when you create an educational environment that's there to inspire and to push people to levels they didn't think they were capable of achieving, then that's that ought to be a goal of every architect.
Yeah, this is where the interesting conflict comes in, though. You mentioned pushing people towards their potential, and people sometimes have their own ideas about where their potential is that may not actually fit in with the design. How do you handle that?
Because you create the dialogue, through the environment.
Yeah.
You create the language that initiates the question. I think the problem with our environment is that we don't even have the question. People don't think about, well, what am I capable of doing? What do I aspire to be? What can I reach for in the future? What can I do? There's nothing in our environment that asks that question. But if you have an environment that does, then I think you will create a society that's unlike anything we've ever experienced in the past. But so how do you do that? So you just have to, I think you need to initiate the question. And you initiate the question by creating an environment that asks the question. And I mean, you can even create an epigram, a saying in the environment that says, what am I capable of being? And that's okay too. It's perfectly valid. And so I'm trying to ask those questions. And I find that when you ask the questions, people start to take notice. They start to stand up and say, you're right, I am capable of doing things. And I've just never had it be asked to me. So, so if you can create that kind of environment, I think wonderful things can happen.
Okay, Eugene, thank you very much for coming. We have to start asking the questions somewhere, and you've certainly posed some provocative questions. Again, I recommend Eugene Tsui's book, Evolutionary Architecture. He's also the author of several other books on architecture and urban planning. We've put some of the web links up there at the bottom of the screen, and I urge you to have a look at them. So for Conversations, this is Scott Turner. Thank you for joining us, and have a good day.